Zoom protocols. Good evening, everyone. We're allowing people to join, so just bear with us for a few minutes while we get everybody started. I should tell you all tonight we're discussing the 16th president, and on next Monday evening we will be discussing the 41st president. So if you're interested in presidential history, please make a point to join us on Monday, November 8th, as Jean Becker speaks about her book, The Man I Knew, which is about George Herbert Walker Bush. It's a wonderful book, and I hope you'll take a moment and register if you're at all interested in presidential history. I think it's very worthwhile to read and to listen to what Ms. Becker has to say. But tonight we're going to discuss the 16th president. He is arguably one of the greatest American presidents. He often is compared to the father of our presidents in our nation, George Washington, as being one of the greatest presidents we've had. And we are going to discuss him with a very famous, noted Lincoln scholar, Michael Burlingame, excuse me. Michael is considered to be the man that knows more about Lincoln than any other living person, according to the great Civil War historian, James McPherson. Mr. Burlingame has written numerous books about Lincoln. I would encourage you to read any and or all. I confess I've only read 3, but just those 3 make me in strong agreement that he is one of our greatest living Lincoln scholars. He currently is the Chancellor of Naomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies, and he holds that chair at the University of Illinois in Springfield. Some of you might know that Abraham Lincoln was very closely associated with Springfield. So it makes perfect sense that Mr. Burlingame would be the resident scholar on Lincoln there. He currently resides in Connecticut, however. I would encourage you all to read his vita, his credentials. He is as well credentialed as they come when it comes to being a Lincoln scholar. Tonight, he's going to talk about his newest book about Lincoln. The Black Man's President is the title. He has another very contemporary, very recent book about Lincoln, and it's called The American Marriage with Mary Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln, and it sort of uncovers their marriage. He's most known and rated Abraham Lincoln, A Life is one of the 5 best books written about Lincoln, and I believe you wrote that in about 2009, 2010. Am I correct?
That's correct. Just in time for the 200th birthday.
So we're going to discuss the man and why he's called the Black Man's President. So without further ado, Dr. Burlingame.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Gwen. I'm very grateful to you for those words and also for the invitation. I relish every opportunity I can get to speak about my favorite subject without having to grade any of my listeners' papers or exams. So thank you. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, the book has just come out. It's called, as Gwen said, The Black Man's President, and has a subtitle, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans, and the Pursuit of Racial Equality. And you may wonder about the title. It's not my idea. That is a term, a description of Lincoln that was given to him by Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, 6 weeks after the assassination of the president, delivered a eulogy in New York at Cooper Union, in which he called Lincoln emphatically the black man's president, the first to rise above the prejudice of his time and his country, the first to honor black men as citizens by inviting me, Frederick Douglass, to the White House to consult on public affairs. Lincoln was saying, by that gesture, I am the president of the black man as well as the white man, and I mean to honor their rights as men and citizens. Now, this eulogy, delivered on June 1st, 1865, is very little known, even though it was given at the premier spot in the country, Cooper Union, to give a speech. And even though it was written up and reported in the New York Herald, which was the most widely circulated newspaper in the country, and in the New York Times, but somehow this magnificent speech has been omitted from anthologies and collections of Douglass's speeches, the big 5-volume edition that was done by Yale years ago, and then a 4-volume edition that was done a few years before that. And it's very different from a speech that lots of people know that Frederick Douglass gave about Lincoln 11 years after the assassination. And that speech was given at the dedication of a statue of Lincoln in Washington, D.C. It's called the Emancipation Memorial, and it's been in the news lately because it's been controversial in the eyes of some. It's insufficiently acknowledging Black agency in bringing about emancipation. And in that speech in 1876, Frederick Douglass said Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, and we Black people were only his stepchildren. And I knew that when I was doing my research years ago. I was, of course, familiar with that speech, as is everybody who pays any attention to the question of Lincoln and race. And you can imagine my surprise as I'm going through the Frederick Douglass newspaper manuscripts at the Library of Congress. And among those manuscripts, I find a speech, this eulogy in Douglass's handwriting. And I checked it out and saw that it was reported in the newspapers. And so I thought, how could I have missed this? Surely this is included in that massive edition of 5 fat volumes that the Yale Press released a while back. And so I went back to the library and looked at volume 3. It had the speeches from the war, and it's not there. And I was astounded. And so I've done what I can to encourage people to pay attention to that speech. And I'm hopeful that that book will serve that function. And you might ask, well, why did Frederick Douglass call Lincoln preeminently the white man's president after having called him emphatically the Black man's president? Well, I think the answer is this, that in 1876, Frederick Douglass was worried very much, understandably, about the collapse of Reconstruction. That starting with Lincoln's final speech calling for Black voting rights, for the next few years, there was great progress made toward Black people becoming first-class citizens. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment establishing Black civil rights, the 15th Amendment establishing Black voting rights, the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, the Enforcement Acts designed to carry out the provisions of those amendments, all had been passed by Congress and they were enforced by the administration. But by 1876, enthusiasm for Reconstruction had waned. The government was no longer enforcing the laws rigorously. The public in general seemed to be losing interest in racial justice, and Reconstruction seemed to be on the verge of failure. And in fact, it did fail shortly thereafter. And so what Frederick Douglass was doing that day, I think, was giving a speech that had a subtext. And the subtext was this, and it was addressed to the power elite that was in the audience. The president was there, members of the cabinet were there, leaders of Congress were there, Supreme Court justices were there. And so Douglass was really speaking to them as well as to the large audience of Black people. And what he was saying to them is, look, don't let Reconstruction go down the drain. It was started by Abraham Lincoln during the war. It was given a big boost by him in his last public speech when he called for Black voting rights. And he did that not because he was some kind of bleeding heart sentimentalist do-gooder, but because he was a tough-minded defender and promoter of the interests of the white race. And he realized that it was in the interest of the white race for the Black race to be treated like first-class citizens. So don't let Reconstruction go just thinking, oh, well, that was a nice gesture by the bleeding hearts. It was proposed by a tough-minded president whose interests were primarily to promote the interests of white people. So I think that explains why this discrepancy exists. And the point of my book is to show that Lincoln was, for all intents and purposes, a racial egalitarian. And the approach I take is this: instead of just looking at Lincoln's speeches and policies and letters and the traditional sources, I examine how Lincoln interacted with Black people face to face in Springfield and in Washington. And there's abundant evidence that almost all the Black people with whom Lincoln dealt were impressed by his freedom from prejudice, by his cordiality, by his respect, by his courtesy, and that the theory that I'm working with is that interactions speak louder than words. That if you want to know somebody's racial attitudes, see how they interact with members of the other race. And so that's what the book's about. And be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it, okay?
Thank you. I have all sorts of questions. I also want to encourage all of you to post your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I will do my best to get through them all. But Lincoln is quite the topic. I think we forget, at least I forget, there are over 15,000 books written about him. About a third of the statues in the United States are of Lincoln. He has everything from a comic book to an aircraft carrier named in his honor, which gives you and highways. We have the Lincoln Highway, for heaven's sakes, which is also the topic of another current book. He was quite the man for us. Unfortunately, he left us a little too early. He didn't get us through the whole mess of Reconstruction. I think one of the reasons that you can cite that he can be called the Black man's president was that he very much was behind enrollment of the African Americans in the United States military, which brings me to one of my big questions right off the top. The U.S. colored troops are well known for fighting in the Civil War. And in fact, it's my understanding either 16 or 17 of them were given medals of honor in 1865. In fact, they were given medals of honor in April of 1865. And we also know, unfortunately, that Mr. Lincoln left us in April of 1865. Are you aware if he literally knew of those medals and had approved those medals to the U.S. colored troops?
I'm sorry to say I don't. But it's hard for me to imagine that he would have disapproved, because he was a very enthusiastic supporter of the use of Black troops and paid a handsome tribute to them in his speeches and writings, and was deeply moved by the service that they had provided, and said that they really provided the crucial extra element that made victory in the war possible. But while we're mentioning April of 1865, if I could add a little footnote, one of the things that I want people to realize that is not widely understood is that Abraham Lincoln was not murdered because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which is here on my tie, which liberated the slaves in the Confederate States. He was not murdered because he supported and ushered the 13th Amendment through Congress, which freed slaves everywhere in the United States. He was murdered because on April 11th, 1865, 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered, virtually ending the war, 2 days thereafter, Lincoln gave a public speech from the White House, which drew a huge crowd. And the crowd expected a victory lap speech. We won, they lost, let's hear it for the Army and the Navy. Well, Lincoln was not inclined to give such a speech. Instead, on that evening of April 11th, he gave a very sober analysis of Reconstruction, of now what should be done with the 11 states who joined the Confederacy. What sorts of criteria must they meet in order to be politically rehabilitated? And in the course of his remarks, Lincoln described his efforts to bring about Reconstruction. And he said that my plans have been criticized in part because In Louisiana, where the most advanced progress has been made, Black people have not been granted the vote. Now, I personally would prefer to see at least some Blacks given the vote, that is, people who served in the military and the very intelligent. And by very intelligent, we're pretty sure he meant literate. And Frederick Douglass was in the audience that day. And Frederick Douglass later wrote saying that I and my fellow abolitionists were disappointed in that speech because of its limited scope. It called only for a relatively small number of Black people. So about 186,000 troops Black troops had served. Of course, not all survived the war, and then the literate. But we shouldn't have been disappointed, because we should have realized that that was a very significant speech, because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. Having done that, then you take a big hammer, a maul, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that day that Lincoln was inserting the thin edge of the wedge into the log. And once he had done that publicly, you could count on him to follow through and drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And so Douglass, this was in December of 65, says we badly underestimated the importance of that speech. But there was a young actor there who heard the speech who did appreciate its significance, and that was John Wilkes Booth. And he turned to his companions as soon as he heard Lincoln mention Black suffrage. And he said, that means N-word citizenship, by God, that's the last speech he's going to ever give, and I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, Lincoln was murdered by Booth because he called for Black voting rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to regard Lincoln as a martyr to Black civil rights, as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Viola Liuzzo or James Reeb or Mickey Schwerner or James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, all those people who were murdered back in the 1960s as they championed the civil rights movement of that era.
Lincoln is known for taking a strong stand on controversial issues and almost being passionate about it in some ways, I would argue. And today we seem to be at a national reckoning about the legacy of slavery and racism. And we come to Lincoln again at the core of this argument with his actions that occurred during the 1860s. It sort of brings me to the question about voting. And, recently, I believe yesterday or today, the John Lewis voting legislation was failed in the United States Senate. If Lincoln were alive today, do you think that that would be his top priority? Or do you think he would be championing climate change or worrying about 9/11 or COVID? Do you think that he would still be as passionate and on the issue of voting?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that Lincoln's support for Black voting rights was controversial, but strong. But at the same time, Lincoln was very aware of the problem of illegal voting. That in Illinois, for example, there was a process known as colonizing, that is, in state elections for the state legislature, which then in turn elected the senator. You didn't have direct election of senators back in the 19th century. That's a 20th century reform. And so senatorial elections often were a result of state legislative voting. And so voters would be shuttled around. If a district had plenty of extra votes for one party or the other, people would go over to the next county where there was where it was a close call, and they would vote there. And Lincoln was pretty angry about that. And at one point, he even threatened. He said he was going to go out and take a club to people who were illegally voting. So I think Lincoln would have been sympathetic to the idea that we have to make voting available, but we also have to make sure that illegal voting is discouraged. So, and it's hard to say how he would view the legislation that you mentioned, but certainly he would favor extending the franchise, but he would also favor measures to make sure that illegal voting was minimized.
Illinois is not let me start again. Illinois is the home to multiple presidents.
Indeed.
Recently, we had President Obama that came out of Illinois, and
Right.
certainly there were often parallels drawn between he and Lincoln. Can you speak to that a little?
Oh, yes. Well, President Obama began his campaign on the steps of the Illinois state capitol, the old state capitol, that one that Lincoln served in as a legislator, and where he gave his House divided speech, and where he did his law research, and where he practiced before the Supreme Court. So one of the things that the people of Springfield have done is to preserve that state house, which is a remarkable building. And I urge everyone who visits Springfield to make sure to visit the old state capitol. But on the steps of that old state capitol, Obama began his campaign. When he was invited shortly after his election as president and his inauguration to speak in Springfield at the banquet of the Abraham Lincoln Association, which is an organization that was founded at the time of Lincoln's centennial, and here's the bicentennial. So the president was invited to speak, and he did, and he quoted at length a Lincoln document about the functions of government and the aims of government. So he was very much influenced by Lincoln, and the fact that he was the first Black president would doubtless have pleased Lincoln. That Lincoln's central belief about what the United States stood for was obviously democracy, but not just formal democracy. That is to say, widespread voting rights, bicameral legislature, separation of powers, Bill of Rights, all that sort of thing. That he was very concerned about, of course. But what he was really concerned about was having a society where there was social mobility. That is to say, where people could advance as far as their talent and their industry and their virtue and their ambition would take them. And that there should be no artificial barriers keeping people from getting ahead as far as their talent and their industry and their virtue would take them. And he was a classic example of it. He really came from true hardscrabble frontier poverty. And in his early career as a politician, he championed issues that had nothing to do with slavery. That was he championed what was called the Whig system. He was a Whig, which was the predecessor of the Republican Party. And that was high tariffs, transportation improvements, internal improvements they were called then, what we call infrastructure today, and banking, establishment of banks so people could get loans. And that was to end rural isolation, because Lincoln grew up in rural isolation, and there was a lot of poverty, a lot of superstition, a lot of violence, a lot of drunkenness, a lot of ignorance. And Lincoln wanted to have a world where nobody grew up in that kind of situation, where everybody would have decent a standard of living, access to markets, and the like. And so he wanted to liberate people from rural isolation and rural backwardness and rural poverty and superstition and so forth. So his Whiggery was really the philosophy of liberating people. And then as time went by, the scope of his desire for liberation extended to Black people. But it started off with this sense of wanting to liberate people from conditions that made life pretty unpleasant. And certainly slavery did that. And he hated and loathed slavery. The notion that he was a reluctant emancipator is simply wrong. Lincoln hated slavery from the time he was young. And he says that I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And one of the reasons Lincoln hated slavery so much, I argue, is that his father treated him like a slave. But Lincoln's father didn't get along very well with his son. And one of the reasons was that his father discouraged Lincoln's education and interrupted it. Lincoln had a tiny amount of education, less than a full year of formal schooling. And that was because his father, when Lincoln was an adolescent, would pull him out of school and read him out to neighbors, because his father was very inept at making money and meeting his responsibilities. So he was constantly needing money. So he would then rent his son to neighbors, and Abraham would make some money, and he would have to turn it over to his father, because that was the law of the land in those days. You weren't the property of your father, but any labor that you performed belonged to your father until you were 21. So if you made any money laboring on the outside, you had to turn over the money to the father. And then when Lincoln came to champion the anti-slavery cause, he emphasized one argument over and over again that was not emphasized heavily by most anti-slavery champions. And that is that it was an outrage that somebody went out and worked in the hot sun all day and somebody else derived all the profits. Now, he wasn't the only one to make that argument, but I thought it was noteworthy that he emphasized that argument to the virtual exclusion of all the other arguments about the cruelty of slavery and the breakup of slave families and all that sort of thing. And I think that's because Lincoln could relate to that he had been treated like a slave and had turned over all of his money to his father. And that he then empathized with slaves and resented slaveholders the way he resented his father. So now I am a psychohistorian. That is one word, by the way. There are psychohistorians as two words, but I fancy that I do not belong to that category, although not everybody I know would agree with that necessarily. Anyway, that's a long way of answering your question. Sorry.
So Lincoln was as human and flawed as all the rest of us. He certainly had his flaws. I'm sure he yelled at somebody at least once that didn't deserve it. He must have been a man, although I never knew him, that could move throughout society and throughout the classes and speak to everyone.
Yes,
I'm sure he must have told an off-colored joke once or twice. And I was deeply impressed about the story that you wrote in your book about the gentleman who he issued a document to in order so that the man could find a reasonable job. And he ultimately co-signed a loan essentially for this gentleman. And I was kind of wondering if you could repeat that story to me.
Oh, by all means. Thank you for bringing that up. This gentleman is named William H. Johnson, and he's a Black gentleman in his early to mid 20s, and he worked for the Lincoln family in Springfield. And when they left to go to Washington in February of 1861 when Lincoln to be inaugurated, William Johnson came along. He was on the train. He was helping. He was a kind of body man, a body servant to Lincoln. And when Lincoln got to the White House, he wanted to place him on the staff, but also have him as a personal valet, in effect. But then there was a revolt by the African-American staff members of the White House crew, who were all light-skinned, and William H. Johnson was dark-skinned. And there was a lot of prejudice among African-Americans of light skin against African-Americans who had dark skin. And it's become known as colorism in modern terminology. And so poor Lincoln then, after 3 days of what was almost a revolt by the staff, by the African-American staff, sent him to the furnace room. So he was out of sight. And then he worked hard to get him a job elsewhere in the administration. And you would think he could do that by snapping his fingers. Well, it took a while before finally William H. Johnson was able to obtain a position in the Treasury Department as a kind of assistant librarian. And the Treasury Department is right next to the White House. So Johnson would come over to work at the White House as Lincoln's body man, and then he would go work as a messenger and as an assistant librarian at the Treasury Department library. And then William Johnson got married, had a family, and he bought a house. And Lincoln had signed the loan guaranteeing that the bank would be paid off. And so William H. Johnson then dies because he went with Lincoln to Gettysburg in November of 1863. And he came back along with Lincoln and had smallpox. Now, Lincoln had a very mild case of smallpox called varioloid, but William H. Johnson had a severe case, and it killed him. Shortly after his death, after William Johnson's death, the banker was speaking with Lincoln and said, "Oh, I understand your barber and your valet has died." And Lincoln says, "Oh, yes, poor William. He got the smallpox and it killed him. I hope I didn't give it to him." And then the banker says, "Well, you signed a loan. We gave him the money to buy his house." And Lincoln said, "Well, don't worry, I'll pay it off." And the banker says, No. He says, "We have charity contributions and we could just write this off to charity." No, Lincoln said, "Look, I promised to do this and I want to do it." And so the banker said, "Well, okay, but we'll split it in half. You took a risk in signing the loan. We took a risk in making the loan. So we'll split it 50-50. But Lincoln said, well, no, you've got to include in that 50 the interest payment too." And so the banker then said to Lincoln, "Well, you do endorse the Negro?" And Lincoln said, "Yes, and I don't deny it." And then there are some people who think erroneously that William H. Johnson is buried in Arlington Cemetery on a grave site that has a tombstone that says William H. Johnson, citizen. Well, it's highly likely that he was buried in a separate graveyard that was for Black people who had died of smallpox, and that's long since gone. And that William H. Johnson is not an entirely uncommon name. And also the word citizen on a tombstone in that part of Arlington Cemetery, where both my parents are buried, the word citizen in that era only meant civilian. It didn't mean that Lincoln was having that tombstone carved specially to say that I believe Black people should be citizens. Now he did, of course, and that's what got him shot. But it's important not to read too much significance into that word citizen or that tombstone.
Lisa wants to know about movies. Are there particular movies, perhaps the one with Daniel Day-Lewis, that really embody his attitude toward African Americans that you endorse?
Well, the best of the recent movies is, of course, Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, in which you get some sense of Lincoln's interaction with Black people, particularly Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley was the Black woman seamstress, dressmaker to Mrs. Lincoln, who was a close friend of both Lincolns. And she wrote a memoir shortly after Lincoln's assassination, 3 years later, in which she shared an awful lot of information about what happened in the White House and what Lincoln was like, and she later said that he always treated her with the utmost kindness and respect, and she was devoted to him. That he had no trace of prejudice or bigotry. And she was one of several, but she interacted with him a lot. A lot of the people I read about in the book come to the White House, meet with the president, have a conference, and then it's written up in a newspaper, or that person then writes a memoir. But that's a one-off. But with Elizabeth Keckley, had practically daily interactions, and so she was able to speak with some authority about what Lincoln was like in dealing with Black people, and so her memoir is one that sheds light on that subject, and it puts Lincoln in a very good light, and you get some sense of that in the movie. Now, one of the aspects of that movie you may recall is the relationship between Thaddeus Stevens, who was the leader of the radicals in the House of Representatives, who was a critic of Lincoln. Lincoln isn't moving fast enough, and Thaddeus Stevens was a real racial egalitarian. He insisted on being buried in a Black graveyard. In those days, graveyards were segregated, and his mistress was Black, and that comes out in the movie, Lydia Smith. And so that's the movie that deals the most clearly with any kind of relationship with Lincoln and Black people. Now, the two most famous movies before that were way back in 1940, 41, Young Mr. Lincoln, and Lincoln of Illinois. And that, the Lincoln of Illinois is a particularly good one. The one was with Henry Fonda as young Mr. Lincoln, and the other Lincoln of Illinois was with Raymond Massey. And that second film has a great speech toward the end, about a 10-minute speech, which is a conflation of many of Lincoln's more famous speeches, particularly those during the debates with Douglass. And that's a really terrific segment. And Henry Fonda is fun as young man Lincoln, but those don't deal with Lincoln and his interaction with Black people. So Steven Spielberg's, I think, is the one that most closely approximates what the questioner asked.
I think that as human beings, all of our beliefs over a lifetime change and evolve. I would like to think that Lincoln's did as well. Mm-hmm. And certainly when you're married and living daily with another human being, discussions go every which way under the sun. You might want to speak a little bit to how Mary Todd Lincoln may have had an affect on Abraham Lincoln and his beliefs and her background.
Yes, well, Mrs. Lincoln has been sometimes described as an ardent abolitionist. In fact, the standard biography of Mary Todd Lincoln for a long time, published back in the 1950s, made that argument. But it's simply wrong. She was not an ardent abolitionist. She was from Kentucky. She had been raised in a slaveholding family, a prosperous slaveholding family. She had been pampered. She had slaves to do all kinds of work for her and her family. And she imbibed the kind of attitude toward Black people that was common among Kentucky slaveholders, that their benevolence toward the staff, but no notion that they would be social equals or voters or anything of the sort. And in fact, Mrs. Lincoln demonstrated as First Lady, even though her best friend was a Black woman, Elizabeth Keckley, her seamstress, her dressmaker. She demonstrated some racial bigotry on more than one occasion. And one of the striking features about Lincoln and African Americans is that African Americans began coming to the White House receptions during the Lincoln administration. And one of the biggest ones was the New Year's reception in 1865. A few had come in 1864, but then several had shown up, many shown up in 1865. And as they started to come through the receiving line, Mrs. Lincoln bowed to the first Black woman that came by and a nod. And then the second one, she was a little nonplussed. And on the third, she was aghast. And she told the guards, don't let any more of these people in. Now tell them they can come later when all the white folks have gone, but they mustn't come in now. And then in February of 1865, this was the following month, Mrs. Lincoln had a big reception, big gala reception, and Sojourner Truth, the Black abolitionist woman, very famous, came to the White House to attend Mrs. Lincoln's reception. She was denied admission. And the next 2 days later, Lincoln was told about that. And he said, well, he was shocked and appalled, and that he had met with with Sojourner Truth earlier, and he admired her, and he would make amends and invite her back. Well, that didn't happen because he died shortly thereafter. But so Mrs. Lincoln's record as a racial egalitarian is very spotty. And she referred in letters to Black people as darkies, which is a sort of pejorative. And then she writes a letter of recommendation for Keckley for a job, in which she says, even though she's a Negro, she's very industrious. So you think, oops, the implication being that Black people by nature are not industrious. And there is evidence that she opposed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now that evidence is from well after Lincoln's death, and it's supposed to come through Robert Lincoln, through a friend. And it's not established beyond peradventure, but it wouldn't be surprising if that were actually true. So that she, And Mrs. Lincoln was not a political animal. That is to say, she didn't pay attention to policy issues. She didn't care about the larger issues of statecraft and policy. She cared about politics insofar as that was her husband's profession, and she wanted him to become famous so that she would become famous. But when it came to issues and political philosophy and the like, she was ignorant. And she said that. She says, I don't know anything about politics, but I know what I like. And so she had almost no influence shaping Lincoln's thinking about race or indeed any other public matter.
Lincoln seems to be championed by each of the political parties here in the United States. The Republicans use quotes from him. The Democrats use quotes from him. Certainly one of the biggest topics of discussion about Abraham Lincoln in the last 2 or 3 years has not been political, but rather the book Lincoln and the Bardo. Are you familiar with it? I know that it's a fictionalized account, but I wasn't sure if you had read it and if you have an opinion on it.
I have tried to read that book, but I gave up halfway through. I didn't know what was going on. There's so many characters. and the central theme is that Lincoln was deeply moved by the death of his son, Willie. And that Willie is in this kind of limbo with scores of other people. It's hard to keep track of without a scorecard. And I must say, my first book is mentioned and quoted a few times, which any author is very gratified to have his work quoted in a best-selling book like Lincoln and the Bardo. So I said, this can't be all bad, but I just had to eventually throw up my hands. I just didn't know what was going on. But the whole question about Lincoln and Willie is a very poignant one. The Lincolns had 4 children, all boys. The first was Robert, who was the only one who survived into adulthood. And then he became a prominent businessman and Secretary of War and minister to Great Britain, very successful. The second one was named Eddie, and he died at the age of 3 in Springfield. The third was named Willie, and he died in the White House at the age of 11 in 1862. And the fourth was known as Tad, although his real name was Thomas, and he died as a teenager in 1871, 6 years after the war was over. And of all those children, the one that Lincoln felt closest to was Willie. And that Willie was the closest to Lincoln in temperament and humor, and intellect, appearance, except they say the one thing is that he was good looking. And that's the one thing he was different from his father, one respect in which he was different from his father. But Lincoln had the extreme pleasure of having a child who was just like him. And as any of you who are parents know, when you have children, you roll the genetic dice. You have no idea what you're going to get. You get a child who's just like you. You may get a child you think, this is a Martian. Where did this kid come from? Has nothing like you at all. Doesn't look like you. Doesn't think like you. Doesn't have your values or humor or anything of that sort. So Lincoln, I think, derived, and Lincoln was never very close to Robert. They were just, Robert was closer to his mother and temperament and values and all that. Eddie, we don't know. He was 3 years old when he died. Willie and Abraham were very close. Tad was what we would call today learning disabled. He had a speech defect. He apparently had mental, some learning disabilities. And Lincoln was very fond of him, but he wasn't the kind of clone that Willie was. And so Lincoln derived a great deal of pleasure from his relationship with Willie. And that was particularly important for Lincoln in his home life because he and his wife didn't get along at all well. Mrs. Lincoln was a very difficult person, and she made life for Lincoln very unpleasant. And I just, as you mentioned, Gwen, thank you for doing so. I just published a book back in June called An American Marriage, the untold story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. Not you might say untold. Sure, there are a lot of books about the Lincoln marriage, but most of them are very superficial. They're based on a handful of secondary sources. And almost nobody's done the kind of scholarly research that's necessary to write a decent biography or a study of a marriage. And I've really plunged in, and I wrote about the marriage first back in the 1990s, and I've been working on it ever since. And so I have, it's untold in the sense that nobody's really done the kind of research necessary to tell that story in any detail and with any solid factual foundation. In any event, so Lincoln had a very unhappy home life because of his troubled wife. And you got to feel sorry for Mrs. Lincoln, by the way. She's much more to be pitied than censured, although she behaved very badly, because she loses her mother when she's 6. And that's, when you're a kid, you lose a parent. I lost my father when I was an adolescent, but a 6-year-old to lose your mother, that's really hard. And then her father quickly remarries, and she has a stepmother who doesn't like her and makes life difficult for her and her siblings. She then has terrible migraine headaches. She has the manic depressive gene. She has terrible menstrual problems. She had a pretty tough life. Now, she had money, to be sure, and status and all that, but psychologically and physically, she suffered a lot. Nevertheless, it should be borne in mind she made her husband's life pretty miserable. But that was offset by Willie. He derived such pleasure from his relationship with Willie. And then to lose that boy in the second year, actually, it was still less than a year into his administration, was a terrible blow to Lincoln. But luckily, he had a kind of surrogate son, John Hay, who was his assistant personal secretary. And John Hay was funny, very smart, very capable, very well read, and a good companion to Lincoln. So he did have a kind of surrogate son, but that's not the same thing as having a child like Willie die on you at the age of 11.
I want to encourage everybody again to put your questions in the question and answer box or in the chat. I want to ask you, if you were able to have a meal with Lincoln today, what would you ask him? You've spent a whole lifetime studying this man. Certainly, you've got to have a question or two that you would have asked him.
The most controversial aspect of my books, in some ways, has been my treatment of Lincoln's relationship with his father. And Lincoln has very little directly to say about his father. And so I've had to infer from reminiscences of people who knew the father and knew Lincoln, and for the little bit that Lincoln has to say about his father, which is he had nothing positive to say about his father. In fact, when his father was dying, he was in the town of near Charleston, Illinois, about 100 miles from Springfield, and Lincoln could have reached it in a day or two. So Lincoln's father can't write, but he's living with his stepson, John D. Johnston. And John D. Johnston writes to Lincoln and says, look, our father's dying and he'd like to see you now. And Lincoln writes back an astounding letter in which he says, tell our father that it would be more painful than pleasant if we were to see each other now. I thought, my goodness, I was shocked, because no matter how estranged a child may be from a parent, the imminence of death of that parent usually acts as a solvent on that estrangement. And there's some kind of reconciliation, but not in Lincoln's case. And then Lincoln only when he writes about his father, he says his father could only bunglingly sign his own name. And you think, bunglingly? Why did you have to say that? That's pretty dismissive. And then he tells a friend, I think Uncle Mordecai, who was Thomas Lincoln's brother, Lincoln said, I've always thought Uncle Mord ran off with all the talent in that family. Well, that's a real put down of the father. And so I'd like to ask Lincoln, what was your relationship with with your father really like? And did you deeply resent the fact that you had to go out and perform backbreaking farm chores for your neighbors, and every penny that you made then had to be turned over to your father?
Did he deny his father that? I was always raised to believe that his father was a master craftsman. He made these beautiful cabinets.
The evidence for that is spotty. The testimony we have from people who knew him suggested that he was kind of crude, rough carpenter who could do basic stuff, but wasn't particularly good at it. And there are these cabinets which are purportedly by him, but that's a little bit like George Washington slept here. It's hard to know whether those are, because anybody who says, geez, I have a cabinet that Lincoln's father made, that's going to be worth big bucks. It's a little bit like New England, where I've been living lately and have lived for a long time, actually. Real estate dealers are forever saying, well, there's this little room in the house that was actually a hiding place for runaway slaves who, and this house was part of the Underground Railroad. Well, you have to be very skeptical about that sort of thing unless there really is good evidence to that effect. So it really doesn't matter whether the father was a particularly good carpenter or not. What really counts is what was his relationship with his son like? And almost all the evidence that we do have, which is indirect, because Lincoln has very little to say about his father. But the people who knew them both in Indiana and then Kentucky and Indiana and then in Illinois said that there was a pretty strained relationship. And that Lincoln's father could oftentimes be very cruel to him, and that he seemed to like his stepson, John D. Johnston, better than he liked his own son. And that happens sometimes. For example, Lincoln's stepmother seems to have liked Lincoln better than she liked her own son, John D. Johnston, who was something of a ne'er-do-well. But the stepmother was very encouraging of Lincoln. Lincoln remembered her with the utmost fondness. Oh, and by the way, speaking of mothers, you doubtless know that Lincoln purportedly said, "God bless my angel mother, all that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her." Well, that is sometimes taken as a kind of sentimental Hallmark greeting card, Mother's Day greeting card, tribute to motherhood in general. But if you look at the context in which that remark was made, it's a very cold-blooded analysis of Lincoln's genes. Because Lincoln was saying, my mother was the product of a sexual union between a servant girl on a plantation and a master who took shameless advantage of the servant girl. And so my grandfather, the Virginia nobleman, plantation owner, is the one whose genes I got. And insofar as I have an intellect and ambition and drive and all that, it's because of my mother having passed his genes on to me. So it's not a very sentimental tribute to motherhood in general, but a cold analysis of his genetic inheritance through his maternal grandfather.
Can you briefly speak to Lincoln's use of technology and how quickly he was to adapt to new technologies?
Oh, yes. Lincoln would be an early adopter. He would have an iPhone 13 on the day it was issued. He was fascinated by technological innovation and used it a lot. One of the striking features about the Civil War, for example, is the way that the telegraph was used very effectively to coordinate military movements. And Lincoln was fascinated by the latest developments in weaponry. He was a kind of one-man research and development a branch of the War Department. He wanted to know all about repeating rifles, muzzle loading rifles, machine guns, coffee mill gun, as he called it, Greek fire, rifled artillery, and ironclad ships. He was an enthusiast for technological improvement, and he's the only president we've ever had who owned a patent. He invented a system whereby boats that were stranded on sandbars could have water wings in effect that would lift them up and off they would go, which never became much, but actually was a kind of predecessor of submarine technology. So Lincoln was very fond of technological improvement and did everything he could to foster it.
Who alive today reminds you of Abraham Lincoln?
Oh my goodness, Daniel Day-Lewis. I can't say any public figure strikes me. I was a big fan of Adlai Stevenson when I first became aware politically back in 1960. And so he struck me as somewhat Lincoln-esque. And one of my favorite Stevenson stories is when he lost the presidency, and I can't remember whether it was the first time or the second time to Eisenhower, but he was asked how he felt. And he said that he felt like Lincoln, who once said after losing an election that he was like the little boy in Kentucky who banged his thumb, and he was too old to cry, but it hurt too much to laugh. And oh, by the way, Stevenson, of course, was governor of Illinois, and he was a very good friend of the leading Lincoln scholar of that day, a gentleman named Benjamin P. Thomas, whose one-volume biography of Lincoln, published back in 1952, is still the best single-volume biography of Lincoln. My biography is 2 volumes, so but for a 1-volume biography, that's the place to go. It's Benjamin P. Thomas, Abraham Lincoln, a biography. And so Ben Thomas and Adlai Stevenson were buddies, and Ben Thomas helped him write speeches, and so he very much was plugged into Lincoln, and I think had many Lincolnian qualities.
So if you were a teacher in school today in about the middle school or high school period, and you had to teach about Abraham Lincoln to our youth, what's the 1 or 2 sentence abbreviated version of Lincoln that you would tell them?
Well, that he is a living example of the American dream. That is, if you come from hard scrabble poverty, and one of the things about Lincoln that I emphasize in my big book, and all of my books really, is that we oftentimes think of Lincoln overcoming adversity as overcoming frontier poverty and hardship, economic hardship, and that's true. But he also suffered from emotional malnutrition and poverty. That is to say, his mother dies when he's 9. His father is very unsympathetic. His sister dies. His baby brother dies. He has no formal schooling to speak of except a year, and yet he overcomes all that. So and I think a lot of people can identify with Lincoln who are not necessarily financially or economically impoverished, but suffer from psychological malnutrition, and that Lincoln was able to overcome that and to become not just an effective president, but a psychologically whole and balanced and effective leader, because he had achieved a kind of breakthrough psychologically that allowed him to overcome the tyranny of the ego and to become a success in his trade as a lawyer and as a politician. So he's an inspirational figure, I think, for large numbers of people, not just people who are poverty-stricken in the traditional sense, but also who are emotionally shortchanged.
Thank you so much for this evening. It's been a joy to talk to you. It's been a joy to read your books. Thank you for your scholarship over the years. You've taught us a great deal about one of our American heroes, and I deeply appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Gwen.
People of Hudson do as well. You have a standing invitation to come here to the home of John Brown and to see where Lincoln stood and talked to our community. Kay does have one quick question.
By all means.
If there was one book about Lincoln that one should read first, what would it be?
Benjamin Thomas, Abraham Lincoln, A Life. Yeah. Well, thank you again for those very kind words, and may your tribe increase and multiply.
Thank you so much. And again, I encourage you all to purchase his book at the Learned Owl. It made its official debut yesterday, and we're very fortunate to have had you. And he has numerous books on Lincoln. I encourage you all to read them. And Mr. Burlingame, thank you so much. We wish you safe travels between Connecticut and Illinois, and remind you that Ohio is on the way. You feel free to stop.
Thank you. You may live to regret that.
I don't think so. Have a good evening, folks.